All right, so get ready, because today we're diving into something really fascinating, China's approach to foreign policy.
And we're going deep, too.
Oh, yeah. We're not just skimming the surface here.
No.
We've got some incredible source material for this one.
Yeah, excerpts from a book that analyzes China's foreign policy through history.
And get this, direct quotes from the people who shaped it.
Leaders, diplomats, you name it.
The real players.
Exactly.
So basically, our mission today is to understand how China sees its role in the world.
Especially compared to, say, how the U.S. approaches things.
Right, because it can be wildly different.
Yeah.
Okay, so for example, did you know that in the 15th century, China had this massive fleet?
Oh, yeah.
Led by this guy Zheng? They were sailing all over the Indian Ocean.
Projecting power and influence way before anyone else.
It's like an early example of what we call soft power, right?
Absolutely. It shows how China saw itself.
Yeah.
The center of the world.
Wow. Okay, so then fast forward a few centuries and you've got Lord Macartney.
Trying to establish trade relations with China in the 1790s.
Total failure, right? But then 2 centuries later, Nixon shows up.
And boom.
A new era begins.
It's stark contrast.
It's huge.
And it shows how much things have to align for China to engage.
On their terms.
Precisely.
And here's another thing. They see the world through the lens of this board game, Wakey.
A game that's been part of their culture for centuries.
It's like chess, but with way more emphasis on patience and strategic encirclement.
It's a big deal when it comes to their strategic thinking.
So even if all of this sounds totally foreign to you,
Unintended.
stick with us, because understanding their perspective is crucial in today's world.
Let's start with some historical context.
Okay?
China wasn't just a powerful empire for most of its history.
Right.
It was the dominant force in East Asia.
So that kind of legacy creates a deep sense of cultural superiority.
Absolutely. And it shaped their approach to diplomacy.
So it's not like they just flipped a switch and decided to act this way recently.
No, it's been centuries in the making.
Can you give us some specific examples of how this played out?
Sure. Think about early trade with foreigners.
Okay.
For Chinese dynasties, it wasn't about mutual benefit or an exchange between equals.
So what was it about?
Tribute.
Tribute.
Foreigners bringing goods to the emperor acknowledged China's superiority.
It was more about the symbolic gesture.
Exactly. We recognize you're the top dog.
Interesting. So it reinforced their worldview.
Of being at the top rung of civilization.
And that mindset went beyond trade.
Right. Another example is their strategy of using barbarians against barbarians.
Wait, so they would pit rival groups against each other?
It was a strategic approach.
Sounds pretty ruthless.
It was, but it prevented any single threat from becoming too powerful.
So China could maintain peace on its own terms.
For centuries, it worked remarkably well.
But then everything changed, right?
Well, this sense of unquestioned superiority,
Yeah.
it was shattered by the Opium Wars in the 19th century. Suddenly, they're facing Western powers with superior military technology.
Yeah, a series of defeats.
Forced China to sign unequal treaties.
I remember reading about that they had to cede Hong Kong, open up ports to foreign trade.
A period of intense national humiliation.
The century of humiliation.
Exactly. From 1839 to 1949, China was essentially carved up by foreign powers.
And that experience continues to shape their worldview today.
Absolutely. It's crucial to understand this historical context.
It colors everything.
From how they view their place in the world.
To their foreign policy decisions.
All connected.
It makes you wonder, how did they go from this point of weakness and humiliation to the powerhouse they are today?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm definitely hooked. So we talked about this century of humiliation.
Yeah.
A period that obviously left a deep scar on China's psyche.
Right.
But how did they manage to pull themselves out of it and become the global player they are today?
Well, that turnaround is one of the most remarkable stories of the 20th century. It started with a leader named Deng Xiaoping.
Okay.
He recognized that clinging to rigid communist ideology wasn't going to cut it.
Interesting.
He famously said, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice."
Wow, so basically he was all about practical results.
Not ideological purity.
Got it. But how did that actually play out?
Well, Deng made a series of bold decisions.
Like what?
In 1978, he launched a program called Reform and Opening Up.
Okay.
Imagine, after decades of isolation, he suddenly opens the doors to foreign investment.
Really?
Creates these special economic zones along the coast where capitalist principles are allowed to flourish.
That's a huge shift.
It was a radical departure from anything Mao had done.
And it worked. I mean, China's economic growth over the past few decades has been insane.
Absolutely. They've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty.
So that economic miracle is at the heart of their foreign policy today.
It's given them the confidence to assert themselves on the world stage.
In a way they never could before. And that brings us to this idea of Weiqi in action. Earlier, we talked about how this board game reflects their strategic thinking, patience, long-term planning, indirect approaches.
Right.
How does that play out in real-world situations?
Okay, let's take the Sino-Soviet split as an example.
Okay.
In the 1960s, China and the Soviet Union, the two communist giants, had a major falling out.
Wow.
It was a clash of ideologies, personalities, national interests.
So what did China do?
Instead of siding completely with the West, China played a brilliant game of Weiqi.
So they didn't just pick a side, they leveraged the situation to their advantage?
Exactly.
That's clever.
They opened up to the United States.
Right.
A move that shocked the world.
I bet.
Suddenly you have Nixon going to China in 1972,
Yeah.
and this new geopolitical landscape emerges.
So China was able to play the U.S. and the Soviet Union against each other.
Yes, creating space for themselves to grow stronger.
It's a classic example of using barbarians against barbarians. It makes you wonder what their long game is. I mean, what do they ultimately want? Global domination?
Well, that's a question everyone's asking.
Yeah.
There are differing opinions on whether China seeks to replace the U.S. as the world's dominant power,
Right.
or if they're aiming for a more multipolar world where they have a greater say.
So their actions sometimes suggest both.
They do take the One Belt, One Road initiative, for example.
Oh, yeah, the new Silk Road roads, railways, ports. It's mind-bogglingly ambitious.
It is, and it's a clear sign that they're thinking big, playing the long game.
Investing in economic relationships and building influence across the globe.
Exactly.
But it also raises concerns.
Yeah.
Some people see it as a debt trap, a way for China to gain leverage over other countries.
Right.
Then there are the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. They're building artificial islands, militarizing the region. It's making everyone nervous.
There's no doubt that China's becoming more assertive.
And that assertiveness is causing friction with their neighbors.
And of course, with the United States,
Yeah, the U.S.-China relationship feels like the biggest geopolitical wild card out there.
it's a complex relationship for sure.
They're competitors, but also interdependent in so many ways. How do they manage that?
It's a constant balancing act.
Right.
They cooperate on issues like climate change and trade,
Okay.
but then clash over human rights, Taiwan, and technological dominance.
Yeah.
The U.S. sees China's growing military power as a threat.
And China views the U.S. as trying to contain its rise.
It's a rivalry with potentially huge consequences for the whole world.
It's almost like they're speaking different languages, both literally and figuratively, and those differing cultural perspectives, like that Weiqi mindset, make it even more complicated.
Absolutely.
And don't forget, China is still technically a communist country.
Right.
They've embraced capitalism, but the Communist Party is still in control, and they have their own ideology and long-term goals,
So they're playing by a different set of rules.
operating on a different timeline.
And that makes predicting their next move a real challenge.
But that's exactly why understanding their history, their culture, and their strategic thinking is so important.
It's essential knowledge in today's world.
It feels like we've only just scratched the surface here.
We have a lot more ground to cover.
So we've talked about China's history, their economic rise, and that Weiqi mindset. But where does this all lead?
What's the end game for China?
Yeah, it's the billion-dollar question.
Right, and there's no easy answer.
Here.
Our source material actually highlights this tension between two possible paths for China:
What are they?
confrontation or cooperation.
So on the one hand, you have China benefiting from globalization. They're deeply integrated into the world economy.
They built strong trade relationships, attracted foreign investment.
They have a lot to lose if things get messy.
They've seen how economic growth can transform a nation, and they're not eager to jeopardize that progress.
So cooperation makes a lot of sense.
It does.
But at the same time,
At the same time, they're flexing their muscles,
challenging the U.S. in areas like technology,
pushing back against what they see as Western interference.
making it clear that they won't be pushed around anymore.
And within China, there's a growing sense of national pride, this belief that they're reclaiming their rightful place as a global power.
That kind of sentiment can be hard to contain.
Absolutely.
It's like a tightrope walk.
Yeah.
They want the benefits of cooperation.
But they're also driven by this historical narrative of rejuvenation, of righting past wrongs.
Which makes predicting their future so difficult.
Are they going to be a responsible stakeholder in the existing global order, or will they seek to overturn it and create a new system with themselves at the center?
That's the question.
It feels like the stakes couldn't be higher, especially when you factor in things like Taiwan.
Taiwan is definitely a flashpoint.
Yeah, China sees it as a breakaway province that must eventually be reunited with the mainland.
By force, if necessary.
And the U.S. is committed to defending Taiwan's independence.
It's a powder keg.
That could ignite a major conflict.
A war between the U.S. and China would be devastating for everyone.
It's almost too scary to think about. That's why understanding China's perspective is so crucial.
Right. The more we understand their motivations, their historical baggage, their long-term goals,
the better equipped we are to navigate this relationship.
It's not about agreeing with them or condoning their actions. It's about informed engagement, about finding ways to coexist peacefully.
And manage this rivalry responsibly.
Because the alternative is unthinkable.
It is.
So what does all this mean for our listeners?
What can the average person do with this knowledge?
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this geopolitical maneuvering.
Well, first and foremost, stay informed.
Don't just assume that what you see on the news is the whole story.
Read beyond the headlines, seek out diverse perspectives, and be wary of simplistic narratives.
China is a complex country with a complex history.
Engage in thoughtful discussions with people who have different viewpoints.
Challenge your own assumptions.
And if you're in a position to do so, advocate for policies that promote dialogue, understanding, and cooperation with China.
Because the future of the world may very well depend on our ability to manage this relationship wisely.
I think that's a key takeaway.
Yeah, for me, the biggest takeaway is that we're entering a new era, one where the West no longer holds all the cards.
We need to adjust our thinking.
Be more strategic.
And maybe even learn a thing or two from that wake-key mindset.
It's a wake-up call for sure. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
Thanks for joining us. And remember, keep learning, keep questioning, and stay engaged.
Thank you for tuning in to the Power Book of Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our growing community. Click the bell icon so you never miss an update. We have so much more inspiring content coming your way.